Joining us in webinar number
Desde que el organismo de salud
244, since the
del
Andean Health
continente
Organization
inició el
Hipólito
ciclo
Unanue
nacional de
Agreement
Biodivet
started
antes
the
del
cycle
2020.
of webinars in
Son
May
más de
2020.
4 años
It is more
del
than
aprendizaje
4
continuo, desde
years
que iniciamos
of
este
continuous
ciclo de
interlearning since we
webinars en
started this
mayo del
cycle of
2020.
webinars in May
Hoy es
2020.
grato presentar el
Today,
webinar
we are pleased to
Cultivar
present
una
the
cultura
webinar
de paz.
Cultivating a Culture
En
of Peace. In
1971, con la
1971,
creación
with
del
the
Presidente
creation of
Hipólito
the
Unanue,
Hipólito
los
Unanue
gobiernos
Agreement,
de
the
Bolivia,
governments of
Chile,
Bolivia,
Colombia,
Chile,
Ecuador,
Colombia,
Perú y
Ecuador,
Venezuela
Peru, and
se unieron
Venezuela
con
joined
sentido de
together
solidaridad
with a
e
sense of
integración
solidarity
regional
and regional
para hacer de la
integration
salud un
to make
puente a la
health
paz
a bridge
y
for
trabajar
peace
por el
and
bienestar.
work for well-being.
Así, hoy en día el
Thus,
organismo
today, the Andean
internacional de
Health
Hipólito Unanue
Organization,
tiene
Hipólito
una
Unanue Agreement,
importante trayectoria
has an
de unidad,
important
del
trajectory of
trabajo
unit
constante con el
and
Ministerio
constant
de
work with
Salud
the ministries
y
of
las
health
organizaciones socias de los
and the
6
partner
países andinos de
organizations of the
América
6
Central,
Andean countries,
siempre en pro de
always
materializar el
towards
derecho a la
the
salud.
realization of
En
the
plena
right to health.
globalización
In the
tecnológica,
midst of
la
technological
pandemia
globalization, the
post-reacción
COVID-19
cardiovascular
pandemic
del sector
reaffirmed
salud
the
requiere
relevance of the
avanzar.
healthcare
Por
sector for
eso,
life
hoy
with well-being.
constituye una
That
prioridad
is why today
mantener
it
la
is a
salud en el
priority to
centro
keep
de las
health at
políticas
the
y de la
center of
conciencia social
policies and
del
social
bienestar del bien
awareness
común
to
para avanzar en una
unite
sociedad
for the common good
equilibrada y
in order to
equitativa.
advance in a
Salud
society
es el
that cares for
puente
life.
para la
Health is
integración
the
y para
bridge
la
to
paz.
integration and peace.
Reflexiones como estas e
Reflections
información
such
diversa
as
de las
this
acciones que
and diverse
realizamos
information on
las
the actions we
encuentran en el
carry out
Boletín
can be
Noticialud
found
Andino,
in the Noti
edición
Salud
mensual,
Andinas
que invitamos a
newsletter
leer
on
y
its
está
monthly edition,
disponible en
which
la
we invite you
página
to
web
read
del
and which is
Organismo Mundial de
available
Salud y
on
en la
the
vitrina del
Andean Health
conocimiento
Organization
internacional.
website and in the Andean
Además,
Integration
los
Knowledge
invitamos a que
Showcase.
nos dejen su
We invite
nombre,
you to
su
leave your name,
organización y hasta en la
organization, and
caja de
country
comentarios del
in
chat de
the
Facebook
comment
y
box
ahí
of the
preguntar.
Facebook live
En ese
chat or
mismo
YouTube
espacio
live.
pueden dejar sus
In
preguntas
that
o
same space, you can
enviarlas
leave
a
your
través del
questions or
correo
send them
electrónico
via email to
webinarhodasconu@gmail.com. Para acceder al
webinarhodasconu@gmail.com.
certificado de
To access the
asistencia en
certificate of
cualquiera de los
attendance
chats de
in any of
Facebook,
the
o de
Facebook Live
comunidad,
or YouTube
encontrarán
live
un enlace
chats,
fijo
you will find
donde
a
deberán
fixed
llenar
link
una breve
where
encuesta
you must
y
fill
dejar
out
sus
a short
datos
survey and leave your data,
por
such as
favor,
your email address.
verifiquen que su
Please
correo esté
verify that your email
correctamente
address
escrito
is
para el
spelled
envío del
correctly
certificado.
in order to
El
send you the
mismo se
certificate.
recibirá en
The
las siguientes
certificate will be
semanas o
sent to your
sesiones.
email
En
address in
este
the
webinar
following weeks.
seguiremos la
In this
dinámica habitual.
webinar, we will follow the
Iniciaremos
usual
con el saludo
dynamics. We will begin
institucional,
with
seguiremos
institutional
con las
greetings,
conferencias
followed
magistrales
by the
para
keynote
luego
speeches,
realizar un
and then
diálogo a partir de
we
las
will
preguntas de nuestros
conduct a
participantes.
dialogue based on the questions
La
asked
tarea
by
que
the
estará
participants
frente
in the
nuestro.
different
Entonces, por
platforms.
favor, les
So
invitamos a
please,
que
we invite
escriban
you
sus
to
preguntas
write
en
your
comentarios que
questions
tendremos
and
en cada uno de los
comments
diálogos
that we
con
will
las
take into
y
account
los conferencistas. Para
so
iniciar
we can
este
have a
importante
dialogue with
webinar,
our
le doy la
speakers. To
palabra a
begin
la
this
doctora
important
María
day, I
del
would like
Carmen
to give
Calle
the floor
Dávila,
to Dr. Maria del
secretaria
Carmen Calle
ejecutiva del
Davila, who is
Organismo
the
Andino de
Executive
Salud, quien
Secretary
dará
of
la
the Andean Health
bienvenida y el
Organization,
saludo
who
institucional.
will give the
Adelante,
institutional
María
welcome
Doctora.
and greeting. Over to you,
Muchísimas
Dr.
gracias,
Calle.
Bertita.
Thank you very
Bueno,
much,
el Organismo
Bertita.
Andino de
Well,
Salud
the
del
Andean Health
Hipólito Unanue
Organization, Hipólito
fue
Unanue
constituido por
Agreement, was
decisión de los
established by
ministros de
decision
salud
of the
de Bolivia,
Ministries of Health
Chile,
of
Colombia,
Bolivia, Chile,
Ecuador, Perú y
Colombia, Ecuador,
Venezuela en
Peru, and
diciembre de
Venezuela in December
1971.
of 1971.
Desde mayo del
Since May
2020,
2020,
realizamos
we
webinars
have been holding
semanalmente
weekly
para así promover
webinars
el
to promote
emprendizaje
continuous
de
and
manera
constant
continua y constante.
interlearning.
Les doy la más cordial bienvenida
I
al
would
webinar
like to cordially
número
welcome you to webinar number
244, que
244,
tiene como
which
objetivo
aims to
conmemorar el Día
commemorate the
Internacional de la
International
Paz,
Peace
que
Day,
sabemos que es el
which
21
we
de
know
septiembre,
is on
cuyo
September
lema es
21st, whose
cultivar
motto is
una cultura de
cultivating a
paz.
culture of
Una
peace,
redundancia
a necessary
necesaria, ya que la
redundancy,
cultura
since
es algo
culture
que
is
también
also
se
something
siembra,
that is
se
sown,
alimenta, se nutre,
fed,
se transforma,
nourished,
se cultiva
transformed,
y se cosecha.
cultivated, and
Este
harvested.
año se cumple el
This year,
aniversario
This year marks the 25th anniversary of the adoption by the United Nations General Assembly of the Declaration and Program of Action on a Culture of Peace. In that declaration, it is recognized that peace is not only the absence of conflicts, but rather it requires the guarantee of human rights and positive processes, such as dialogue, the ability to resolve conflicts and their causes in a spirit of understanding and mutual cooperation. It requires the exercise of the values necessary for a culture of peace, such as respect for life, the promotion of justice, democracy, solidarity, pluralism, cultural diversity, dialogue, and understanding at all levels of society and among nations. Some data from the Global Peace Index of 2024 that constitute important challenges are as follows. In the Global Peace Index 2024, the average level of peace of countries deteriorated by 0.56%. This is the fifth consecutive year in which global peace has deteriorated. In the last year, 97 countries recorded or registered a deterioration in peace. This is the highest number of countries that have deteriorated in a single year since the index was first compiled. The conflict in Gaza and Ukraine were the main drivers of the deterioration in the Global Peace Index. Inequality in peace continues to grow. The gap between the most and least peaceful countries is now wider than at any time in the history of the index. Armed violence and insecurity have a destructive effect on countries' development. Violence affects the health, development, and well-being of the entire population. Today, with distinguished speakers, we will review relevant data from the Global Peace Index 2024, and we will also discuss significant experiences and challenges to advance a culture of peace. Because health is a bridge for peace, I must emphasize that peace and citizen coexistence are central principles in the strategic plan of the Andean Health Organization and our work with all our partner organizations and with the 33 Andean committees, working groups, networks, the Andean Roundtable for Agreements Against Health Inequalities, formed with delegates from the ministries of health of the 6 Andean countries. Welcome, Michael Collins and Adriana Anacona. Welcome to all the people who are joining us today in the purpose of cultivating peace across all spaces and in everyday life. Thank you very much, Dr. Mari Carmen, for your opening remarks. After the greeting of our Executive Secretary, let me introduce myself. My name is Berta Luz Pineda Restrepo. I am a sociologist, coordinator of climate change and inequalities at the Andean Health Organization. And today I will be glad to be in charge of moderating this webinar. Next, we would like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Collins. Michael Collins is Executive Director for the Americas of the Institute for Economics and Peace, the world's leading think tank dedicated to developing metrics for analyzing peace and quantifying its economic value. He has over 20 years of experience in humanitarian work and in adopting positive peace as an evidence-based tool for effective peace-centered development. Thank you, Dr. Michael, for your participation. To you, over to you. Very well. Thank you very much, Berta, Maria del Carmen, Adriana, and all of you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you to celebrate this International Day of Peace. Well, first of all, let me share three thoughts or three areas I want to address today. Peace as a vital sign, a measure of what public health would be. So we can connect the work of the Andean Health Organization with peace. The second aspect I want to address is that in the peace study, there is still an opportunity to study health or well-being instead of the disease. Many times, whenever we talk about peace and conflict, or we talk about peace, what we are actually studying is the conflict. We are looking at countries where there's conflict, and we are trying to determine what is missing. Whereas now there's an opportunity to look at the opposite, these countries where we have high levels of peace, and what is it that these countries have in common? Usually. So today I will introduce our research around that. I would like to talk about the culture of peace, but I would also like to offer you a counter argument. There are some socioeconomic aspects that could be influenced by a culture of peace, but they also promote and encourage the foundations for the creation of a culture of peace. So in that regard, it's somewhat cyclic and systematic. So we will present the research study conducted by my institute from this particular perspective. And let us start. If you allow me, I will start sharing my screen. Very well. So at the level of the work of my institute, I have been fortunate to represent the institute here in New York. We have an HQ. I am starting to speak quickly. I have been asked to speak slowly because we have simultaneous interpretation. So we have an HQ in Australia. We are an Australian organization, although we do have global presence. We developed the Global Peace Index, as pointed out by Maria del Carmen, and thank you very much for sharing some of the results of this year's index. This is a global exercise to measure peace covering 163 countries all over the world. And the work of the Institute in broader terms has to do with trying to respond to these two questions that you have in front of you. First of all, which are the most peaceful countries in the world? And secondly, and more importantly, what is it that these countries have in common? How do they inform and create this culture of peace? And what is the culture of peace? Or what is it that all these countries have in common? If you hear me talk about positive peace, it's because these are a couple of terms that are extensively used in peace studies. On the one hand side, we will have the negative peace, which is a more superficial peace where there is an absence of violence or fear of violence. This is something quite good, but what we need to understand is which are the attitudes, the institutions, the structures that create and underpin or support these levels of peace, this absence of violence or fear of violence. So we talk about positive peace as the set of attitudes, institutions, and structures that I just referred to. The Global Peace Index that has been referred to by Maria del Carmen, and these are the results of the year 2024, you might be able to identify your own countries. This map is available online, free of cost. It's quite dynamic. You can click on any country and it will show you the results of the index. It tries to make a peace measurement covering different domains and indicators. A negative peace, at present, we are trying to measure the absence of violence or fear of violence. Even though I must admit that when we look at low levels of homicide, it is helpful to look at where is it that we have homicide metrics in this case. So for this first step, we use these levels of violence around the world. For instance, conflict measures. Maria Carmen mentioned Ukraine and Gaza. These countries which are in conflict right now have very low levels of peace. So we can use it as a metric. We also have other more internal aspects that we can use as metrics. For instance, previously I mentioned the levels of homicide, or we can talk about the levels of crime or violent demonstrations, political instability. All of these are symptoms and signs of this lack of peace, and therefore we can use them to understand which are the most peaceful countries in the world. In terms of levels of militarization, for instance, even though we do not issue any opinions on which would be the optimum levels of militarizations, it is understood that if a country needs an army or needs a police force, it is in order to maintain the order, or they have imperialistic visions, or they are afraid of being invaded. This is once again a symptom of an absence or lack of peace, lack of violence, or fear of violence. So if we consider all these metrics as a whole, we can better understand which are those countries that have the highest levels of peace, which are the countries that have less homicides, that have less crime, that have less high levels of militarization and less conflicts. And as a result of that, and I will explain later on, which are the exercises that help us to support and sustain this society. So what Maria del Carmen also mentioned is that it allows us to do a number of interesting things. How much, which has been the increase or decrease in the levels of peace in the last year, how many countries improved in terms of peace compared to how many countries deteriorated their levels of peace. At a more granular level, we can look at the specific indicators that have improved or that have deteriorated from one year to the other. Since we manage data that run for 10 years, we can then see some changes in trends worldwide. For instance, through this particular chart, we can see that even though the healthcare measures or the security and citizen protection measures have remained equal or the same all over the world, as average, we have seen a significant increase in terms of the levels of conflict globally. And if we look at this blue line on the bottom, even though we see that the levels of militarization have improved, that we have become less military in nature, now there is another increase. As a society, we are becoming more militarized, and this is the result of the increase in the level of armed conflicts. Let us not forget that the most peaceful societies or countries are those that do not only have low levels of conflict, but they also have low levels of militarization, because they do not need to have a high level of militarization to maintain these high levels of peace. So this metrics or this study allows us to see from one year to the other, which are the countries that have high levels of peace and which are those that have low levels of peace, which are the ones that are improving or are deteriorating. Let us understand that this is a dynamic process. There are some countries that tend to be more peaceful one year after the other, but this could change from one year to the next, evidently. And there's a they might change positions depending on what is happening in a specific country. So, for instance, to share this example, in this case, the Latin America example, the case of Ecuador, right now they are in position 130 out of 163, and their peace level has deteriorated over the last 2 years, largely because of the dynamics we are evidencing in terms of the trafficking of drugs through the Latin American countries and the presence of criminal organizations and the effects that this could have on society. And evidently, in the case of Ecuador, also the political instability has affected them. So all these metrics as a whole have led to this drop. And here you can identify other countries that have also experienced these drops. So if we look at the lower part of this list, we can see some countries here. Let me also tell you that the index does not try to judge any country in particular. If we take the case of Ukraine, for instance, irrespective of our own perspective, even though Ukraine is within the 10 least peaceful countries in the world, Ukraine does not have the unique responsibility for these low levels of peace right now. So we need to see it that way, and not just that these countries have, morally or ethically speaking, some sort of problem, or on the contrary, that they have been absolved of anything. Here we are looking at hard metrics, but it's important to see that the countries that are doing much better this year, for instance, some of the countries that you see on the screen, these countries that are becoming more peaceful, and in the understanding that this is a dynamic that changes constantly. We are going to look at another Latin American case, the case of El Salvador. We have received many questions about El Salvador. There has been a significant reduction of homicides in El Salvador, a significant reduction of crime in the country as well. There has been a significant increase in the percentage of the population who feels safe. So all of that looks very well, but it is achieved at a certain price. 1% of the population is in jail, is imprisoned in the country. So this is a negative aspect. So in the meantime, these positive aspects have led to an increase in the levels of the position in the peace index, but it is still holding a very low position at the international level, at the international ranking. But it's important to understand this improvement, and it is also important to understand which are the characteristics that the most peaceful countries have, not only these 10 countries that you see on the screen, but usually the ones that are on this higher position. So how do we address this at the Institute, and how can this inform a culture of peace? Well, we start with a perspective of we do not know what a culture of peace means. We assume that it has to do with a generosity or diversity or the capacity to understand the perspective of others. But many other aspects could be involved as well. Perhaps, and sometimes I say this like a joke, this could be the amount of beer that we drink. Who knows? So we try to see this from a data-based perspective, first looking at these levels of peace, and then by making a statistical analysis to see which are the socioeconomic, cultural aspects that all these countries have in common that are more peaceful or who are improving in terms of peace. So we have been doing this type of research for the last 15 years. This is a statistical analysis to statistically understand what helps to create and sustain peaceful societies with low levels of violence or fear of violence. There are many indicators, over 500 indicators that correlate with these improvements in the levels of peace. At a very high level, we see that these 500 indicators fall into what we would call these 8 pillars of positive peace that you see here on the left-hand side of the slide. The countries that improve in terms of peace in a sustainable manner are also able to improve in terms of the proper functioning of the government, free flow of information, access to information that people have, the quality of information that they receive, the acceptance or accepting the rights of others, a good relationship with their neighbors, in this case, at the state level with the neighboring countries, the business environment, all these aspects are very important to create and sustain these high levels of peace that we have analyzed previously. Another interesting aspect is that these countries that are doing better in terms of peace do it more sustainably whenever they make small improvement in each of these pillars instead of making a big change or a big push towards one single pillar. So as a society, as a municipality, or as a country, as a community, as a village, if we decide to focus only on one of these pillars, as a minimum, we need to understand which will be the impact of this exercise on the other positive peace pillars. So we propose this framework as an exercise for reflection or as a practical tool to determine whether our actions can actually contribute to creating a society, a community, a neighborhood which is more peaceful, so we can better understand which will be our impact through this positive peace pillar. So just to share a few practical ideas with you. Well, this is a picture taken in Colombia with members who reintegrated from the FARC and victims of conflict. In this case, they were discussing how is it that they can decide on opportunities to create higher levels of what we now call positive peace in order to enhance or improve the situation of the Algeciras community and other departments of Colombia. Very simple questions that we could ask or that were asked in this case. What score would we give in our community to each of those pillars and why? In terms of the proper functioning of the government, would we give ourselves a 6 or 5 as a score, and why? Let us discuss it. In terms of high levels of human capital, what score would we give ourselves? More importantly, have these things gotten better, or have they become worse over the last few years? This allows us to identify all these different aspects that we still need to address as a system to create a more sustainable peace. And then, for instance, it allows us to better identify the priorities that we have as a community. It turns out that in terms of low levels of corruption, significant progress has been made. Yes, we still need to do more in this regard, but we need to focus on the pillar of equitable distribution of resources. Because of these reasons, let us focus our efforts on that area, on that pillar. As a way of an example, then we can use this at the level of project definition. If you have identified a pillar, in this case, the equitable distribution of resources, for instance, and you say, I am going to carry out this activity, I don't know, distribution of food distribution, I'm just making this up. How can this or will influence the other positive peace pillars? What are we trying to strengthen here, and how are we going to benefit the other pillars from this? Let us take into account that many times we do something with very good intentions in mind without necessarily understanding the systematic impact that this will have. So by using the positive peace framework as a tool and the many other tools available, we are able to identify which will be our sustained impact. Oh, it turns out that we had this food distribution that we have done in our community, but now we see that this coincides with a very similar pillar initiative that the municipality was fostering. And what we have done without wanting to do it is we are taking away the importance of the work of the municipality, and now the community thinks that the work of the municipality is not good and our work is better. So perhaps if we were aware of that initiative, we would have done our work better and we would have created a better peace culture. I just made that up, but this is just to show you what can be the dynamic of this activity. So usually the positive peace framework, other frameworks and other elements related to this culture of peace offer us this more neutral starting point so we can have productive discussions, especially at instances or levels where we have high levels of polarization. Let me share one final and practical example. We have a global strategic partnership with Rotary International. They have adopted the positive peace framework as a central tool of peace and prevention of conflicts, which is one of their focus areas. This is a group in Cucuta in Colombia, very close to the border with Venezuela. They wanted to work on a water project in a school, and they wanted to ensure that they could reinforce the levels of positive peace in that community as well. So they did a survey in the community asking them which pillars should be more urgently addressed in Yurimaco, in this specific community. In this case, they talked about the good relationships with their neighbors as a critical pillar because there were many refugees and displaced people from Venezuela, and this created tension in the community. So the Rotary Club made them consider whether they wanted to focus on that or whether they wanted to focus on something else. In this case, they were focusing on water. It turns out that the community itself considered that this project could effectively contribute to an improvement in the good relationship with their neighbors. So this adjusted very well to the needs of the community. Furthermore, through this survey, through these conversations, through this poll, they understood that prior water projects had actually generated a lot of conflict in the community because they lacked standards of use, because they didn't properly disseminate and share the project. So using the positive peace framework, they were able to adapt the project. They were able to create norms or standards of use. They created this document that you can see here on the picture to socialize the reason why they had picked this school or this water system to reduce cases of conflict and furthermore to reinforce the levels of positive peace as well. So now I will bring my presentation to a close. Uh, to better understand this culture of peace at the level of data and at the philosophical level, please let me know if you have any questions or comments, and I look forward to the other presentations. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Michael, for such a fabulous presentation. Very significant the work you are doing at your institute in the elaboration of this index for the last 15 years, trying to respond to key questions such as which are the most peaceful countries in the world. He was also telling us that the dynamics can change or that we can find that a country is peaceful, but on the following year, due to a number of reasons, the country is no longer a peaceful country. And from your reflection, we heard about the relationship between peace and well-being. You also emphasized the pillars of a positive peace, which without a doubt, as you raised, this is not just about focusing on one pillar, but rather working on all the pillars. Let us remember that some of these pillars are the good functioning of the government, the equitable distribution of resources, the adaptation, and working on guaranteeing the rights of all people, among many others. Thank you very much for your interesting dissertation. We ask you to please stay in the room, as we have already received comments of very interesting questions that we will answer after the other
Le damos
presentations
la
are
más cordial
over.
bienvenida
We would
a la
like
doctora
to
Adriana Anacona
extend a warm
Muñoz.
welcome to
Es una
Dr.
mujer
Adriana
indígena,
Anacona Muñoz.
yanacuna,
She is an
socióloga,
indigenous
experta en
Yanacuna
políticas
woman from
públicas
Colombia,
y doctora en
sociologist
historia
with a
y
master's in
arte,
public
con
policy and
la
a PhD in history and art,
cum laude,
with
con
a cum
honores,
laude thesis,
docente de
professor of the
educación y
Faculty of
pedagogía,
Education and
integrante
Pedagogy,
del
and a
Grupo de
member
Investigación
of
en
the
Educación Popular de la
Popular Education
Universidad del
Research
Valle en
Group
Cali,
of the
Colombia,
Universidad
parte
del Valle in
evaluador
Cali, Colombia,
reconocida por
peer evaluator
MinCiencia en
recognized
Colombia.
by
Hace
MinCiencia
parte
in
de los
Colombia.
grupos
She is a member of
Extraterritorial
the groups called Epistemologies of the South and
Extemporeidades y Cuerpos del
Territorialities,
Consejo
Spiritualities
Latinoamericano
and
de
Bodies of the
Ciencias
Latin American
Sociales.
Council
Es
of Social
integrante de
Sciences. She
RELAC,
is a
Eval
member
Indígena
of
y del
RELAC,
Consejo
Eval
Latinoamericano
Indígena, and
de
the Latin
Investigación
American
para la
Council
Paz.
of
Adelante,
Research
querida
for
Adriana.
Peace.
Muchas gracias.
Dear Adriana, over to you.
Agradezco
Yes, thank you
este momento y agradezco tan generosa
for giving me
presentación
the
a la
opportunity
doctora
to
María del
address you. And
Carmen
thank you,
Calle,
Dr. Maria del Carmen Calle, for
jefe,
such a kind
a Berta
introduction.
por esta
Thank you,
invitación tan
Berta, for
bonita en
inviting me
torno
to
al
participate in
desafío
this
social,
event,
¿no? Cambio climático y desigualdades del organismo
especially
digno de
around the
salud.
topic of
Al
climate
doctor
change and inequality of
Michael
the United
Collins
Health
muy
Organization.
encantada
Dr. Michael
escucharlo
Collins, I
con
really loved
relación
your
a
presentation
cómo se
when
piensa el
you
tema de
talked
las
about
paces
how
desde los diferentes
do we
países.
measure peace from
Y
the
también
different
honro
country
a 10
perspective.
años de
And
trascender
I
de
would
la
also
doctora
like
Muñoz
to
en la
honor
perspectiva de
10
la paz
years
imperfecta que nos habla
of
no de una
the
paz
perspective of
por estar dañada, sino
imperfect
porque está en
peace
permanente construcción.
that is
Y honro
in permanent
también la vida
construction. I
de
will also
quien
honor the
inspira,
life
que es
of who
Esteban
inspired
Ramos,
me, who is
quien
Esteban
nos ha hablado
Ramos.
sobre la paz
He is
transformadora.
the one who has
A
talked about
propósito, voy a empezar a
transforming peace.
compartir
I will
pantalla.
start sharing my screen.
Espero que allí ya lo puedan ver.
I hope that you can see my screen.
Entonces,
Yes.
perfecto. A propósito de la invitación, yo
Well,
creo que cultivar una cultura
Well,
de
I
paz
believe that
nos
cultivating
permite a
a culture
nosotros
of peace
pensarnos
allow
desde
us
las
to
antes de otros ámbitos de la vida, que es
think
una
about
necesidad
this,
para el desarrollo y para
that
el
this is a
bienestar.
need
En
for
igualdad,
development
paz
and
es una
well-being.
posibilidad de
Cultivating
reducir las
peace is
brechas de
gives us the
desigualdad entre los
possibility to
mundos
reduce
y sobre
the
todo
gaps of
compromisos que los
inequality
estados
worldwide, and it is a
llevan años
commitment
tratando
that the
de
states
cumplir,
have
¿no?
been
Hace un rato se hacía la
promoting.
intervención
A
de
moment
que
ago, they were
se
saying,
conmemora el
why
21 de
is it that
septiembre,
they
Día Internacional de
celebrate
las Paz,
the
y
International Day
además pues
Peace
es
on
un
the
proceso de
21st of
comprensión
September?
de esas
It is also a
necesidades
process
y
for
condiciones
understanding those
inmersas y
needs,
retos de
conditions,
desigualdad
gaps,
y de
and
violencia de todo
challenges of
tipo, ¿no? Ya
inequality
sea
and
estructurales,
violence
biológicas y
of all
culturales.
types,
Me tomó
either
la
structural,
tarea revisar
direct,
un
or
poco sobre el
cultural. I
organismo
decided to do some
andino de
research
salud.
on
Aquí
the
lo que
Andean
tienen
Health
ubicados allí
Organization, and
es
I see
esta
that
carta.
you
Me tomó
quoted
bastante
this
explicar
beautiful
cómo para
declaration
darle
from
lugar a la
2014,
intervención que quiero hacer. Y
so
decía
I can give a
Ban
framework to my
Ki-moon,
intervention.
secretario
Ban
secretario general
Ki-moon,
de las
who was
Naciones
the
Unidas,
eighth
decía lo
Secretary
siguiente,
General of
cito
United
mucho, para
Nations,
que se
said
respete el
we need
derecho
a
a
new
ser
commitment
diferente
to
y
respect the right
aprovechar
to
al
be
máximo
different,
la
to make the
diversidad
most
como
of
una
a
fortaleza para
diversity
compartir
as a
entre todas las
strength to
personas.
share among all
Esta es
people.
la cultura de
Well,
paz.
this is the
Desde
culture
ahí
of
entonces
peace.
mi
From
intervención se
there on,
propone hablar
my
por qué
presentation,
el 21 de septiembre
well,
en
why is it
términos del
that
calendario
on the
andino
21st
es
of
la
September, in
fiesta
terms
del
of the Andean calendar,
Quisquirraimi, ¿no?
we also
Es la
celebrate
fiesta de
the
la luna,
festival
es
or
un
the
tiempo
festivity of
para dar
Kiaraimi.
y
It is the
preparar la tierra.
festivity of
Aquí también estoy
the
honrando el
moon. It is
sistema
the moment to
reconocimiento de nuestros
fertilize
pueblos
and prepare
indígenas
the
por
soil,
el
the
proceso de
land.
proceso de
I
nacimiento de
am
uno de ellos y porque
commemorating the
también creo
indigenous people,
que
not
de
only
alguna
because
manera
I am a
evoluciona
member of this
en la manera
original
como nos
people,
pensamos a
but it
cultivar y
has
cosechar.
to
Entonces, a la
do with the
intervención le
way
hemos
we
llamado
prepare,
interculturalidad
cultivate, and
como
harvest. So
desafío
my
para la construcción
presentation
de la
has been called
paz. Dos
Interculturality
interrogantes
as a
en
challenge
paralelo.
to
¿Qué
peace building.
cultivamos
Two
y qué
parallel
deseamos
questions.
cosechar?
What do we cultivate
Espero
and
también
what
estar
is it
hablando lo
that we wish to
suficientemente
harvest? I
despacio
hope
para
I am
poder lograr hacer
speaking
una intervención
slowly enough so I can address the two purposes of my interventions. Number one, to reflect on the way we understand interculturality in dialogue with peace building or peacemaking, and to make visible some challenges that we face and that will have an impact in peace building. I will talk about decolonial peace, insubordinate peace, some elements that can be found in a collaborative publication where we try to get more closely from the theoretical and methodological perspective to other ways of understanding peace from your own knowledge systems. So in that case, we propose aspects that were raised by Francisco Muñoz, Andes Martinez, and Esteban Ramos on what does it mean to transform conflicts, and it assumes principles of communication, cooperation, and reconciliation. I am convinced that in the midst of war, we have more intention of peace building as mediation processes, and that is why I want to talk about the geography of hope. One first strong idea is that in times of pluralism and equality, to think about diversity, plurality, and interculturality becomes a challenge. This means, on the one hand side, to deepen the understanding and guaranteeing of the principle of equality and equity. Number two, to challenge or question our models of construction based on a patriarchal and racist relationship. We need to consider elements that do not only relate to the countries of the global south, but we need to look at the other countries to see how ideas are different one from the other. You quoted what is happening in Gaza, which is a never-ending process, and it also allows us to provide an epidemiological turn on how we address peace. So all these questions on interculturality, I might not be able to answer all these questions in this presentation, but at least I will leave them for you who are on this call, on this session, but also for all of us to continue talking about this interculturality. We need to think about how to define it, which has been our experience, what is relevant to investigate in terms of interculturality, what is the role played by interculturality in terms of decision-making, challenges at the public level, and we need to think about interculturality beyond the respect for otherness, but we need to see how is it that we value and respect these other ways in which others build the sense of the world and of life. And in this case, perhaps we can establish a dialogue with an aspect that some people call it concepts or ideas, but for me it has to do with a perspective of understanding which subjects are these others. So intersectionality goes through recognizing ethnical aspects, age, gender, territory, and understanding the geopolitical elements of those who demand or those who mediate in a peacemaking process. Though there's a history, a memory, and an identity on that diversity, and some structural violence and cultural and direct violence that shows us forms of discrimination and marginalization that perpetuate aspects that have not let us build peace globally. So interculturality entails thinking about a dynamic and conflicted interaction between cultures. There is always going to be a game of power. Here I'm talking more about coloniality, and this interculturality recognizes that in order to achieve dialogue among cultures, there needs to be elements of reciprocity, but still there are some tensions because it proposes racism as a social and economic situation that has historically existed, and we cannot deny its existence, and that this discussion regarding how racism is institutionalized in the concept of the other, that we deny it and dehumanize it, and by doing it, we are refusing the opportunity to think about other forms of development. So interculturality allows us to focus on processes that go beyond certain outcomes or results or goals or how certain goals are met. How can we address it from the everyday life? And here I want to share another strong idea. To think about reciprocity and these relationships of tension, racism, classism, and hatred, and the way we conceive the other, it should not be based on the sociological or theoretical perspective, but from the everyday life, because that is everyday life on the streets, on the media, on the social media, the social networks. That is where we find most of these types of expressions. And in global terms, it becomes much more recurrent in a more classist language across different scenarios. So interculturality allows us to explore cultural and communication transformational dynamics among the social subjects. Also, it allows us to think about the colonial aspect, which has to do with challenging the structures of power. Consequently, interculturality as an approach to establish a dialogue with peace indicates a cultural policy and an oppositional thinking which goes beyond recognizing the others and including the others, but it has to do with transforming the social and historical and structural transformations that have led to racisms, classisms, and hatred. And due to the inequalities, to perpetuate them not only at the institutional level, but also at the sociological level. So interculturality tends to propose alternatives of other ways of engaging and confronting with power and trying to look at different ways of conceiving lives. That is why the indigenous people way of thinking is not only a discussion, but a critical aspect to do justice, epistemic, economic, environmental, and social justice of what the racialized rural communities have contributed historically to humankind. So interculturality entails the development of alternatives, organization of societies and forms of government. Today, in the public policy scenario, you find this concept of governance, but it is rather recognizing and establishing relationships of trust and confidence where we recognize and demand this structural, social, historical transformation that will give dignity to those subjects who have been historically fighting in trying to overcome the different forms of violence and reducing the inequality gaps. So the difference or the diversity is not just a narrative, but it should be part of that vindication. Therefore, peace, therefore, is not just about thinking about the absence of this structural, cultural, and direct violence, as defined very well by Johan Galtung, but it means recognizing, on the one hand side, a complexity of conflicts and violence affecting peaceful coexistence, where we have embedded a narrative which is not only media-based, but it's also seen at the corporate level, at the regulatory level, and it has to do with exclusion and dehumanization of others. Secondly, it means recognizing our capacity to have an impact on the transformation of conflicts in a non-violent way from our everyday life. They talk about a culture of peace in pedagogical team, and it might seem something abstract, but it is. But it has to do with giving a place to the other. And there's a third element that is worth recognizing: the urgency of questioning evaluations and conceptions that we have of the other, the otherness, which has had an historical identity. So Consequently, thinking about cultivating the culture of peace has to do with recognizing the complexity and the forms of transformation of conflicts and violence, which requires giving place to the capacities of individual and collective social individuals that have tried to address this in a non-violent manner and to compare and report the narrative of hatred or the narrative that do not allow the other to do justice, and in the end, denying it and dehumanizing it. So I do believe that peace should be conceived as a process. I live in a country, Colombia, where unfortunately people just limit peace to a number of agreements, and they limit it. They do not see it as a process, and even some people have dared to talk about ideological elements where when peace is right. So since peace is a process, it goes beyond, it transcends the peace agreement, and it seeks to promote human coexistence, to put an end to all forms of violence, to address all of these different needs. And this is a peace that should be built from and based on the communities. So there are a number of principles from the Andean world which are related to three forms of work that I believe are quite urgent to better understand the way in which we are trying not only to question or challenge the forms of development and all these climate change impacts, but also the way of understanding the decision making at the public level, governing among all of us, or what some people call governance. So the indigenous social movement have allowed us to think about these three types of work. Aini, which is to wanting to learn from everybody, which is reciprocity. Minga, which is to collaborate with everybody, and Mita, to learn by turns. So in that case, we are seeing elements of a process where peace is transformational because it is related to process of interchange, of exchange, of engagement, of people who challenge these forms of violence, but they propose forms of mediation, non-violent or peaceful forms of mediation. And it is imperfect because it involves the different stakeholders, not only from armed conflicts, but also social stakeholders, where society has a significant responsibility in the conception of the other and the intervention of third parties or other stakeholders. So I want to share another strong idea, which is to think about the subjects that are able to promote this transformational and imperfect peacemaking. Some people call this subject agency, others call it empowerment, others call it a re-existence subject because they have redefined their identity, others call them resistant. And the way I call them is weavers of process, so I can relate it to a notion from my community, and they recognize this transformational power. Why? Because these are people who have the critical capacity to question and challenge the models of domination. They also take part of decision-making processes to manage conflict in highly violent context. I originating from Cauca, and I live in the Valley of Cauca, Cali, in Colombia. And in Cali, you can evidence these processes, and they respond to a historical and political process where they carry out different process of weaving in the understanding as a peace pedagogy, where they do not only weave biocultural elements, but also elements of cultural, political, and social bonds or links through these work systems, which is about to learning from everybody, collaborating with everybody, and helping everybody. So the process weaving people are those that contribute to this reencounter and encounter in the different rural and urban territories. And even though I am based in Colombia and in Latin America, I am firmly convinced that there are process weavers around the world. And these people are those who investigate about our ancestral origin. They identify elements of their own knowledge, know-how systems, and as weavers, they are willing to go back and review the processes as many times as necessary or dismantle them to give them the shape we want. Therefore, the process weaving persons in a culture of peace are people who are quite rigorous in the work of weaving those social, cultural, and scientific fabrics or networks as a political expression of our people. And they are the ones who have resisted and re-existed over time and they think about our ancestral identity to question the domination systems anywhere where they live. So they are the ones who allows us to recognize our own know-how systems, both in the defense of the territory, in the social and historical context. They have habitus and consciousness of this identity, titularity, mobilization. Many of them are demonstrating our country defending peace as a right and not as an ideology. So this is my next powerful or strong ideas. I believe that these process weavers live all over the world, even though I am giving Colombia and Latin America as an example, and they allow us to learn more about the geography of hope. What do I mean when I talk about the geography of hope? Also, quoting Gloria Puertas, I heard this term from her for the very first time, and I have been able to write several reports on the defense of life and territory. So a geography of hope is recognizing this process weavers because they are the ones who preserve, own, and safeguard what in literature is known as biocultural know-hows or your own know-how systems. They do this through the know-hows, the arts, and the cultures by taking care of the territories, either rural or urban. This geography of hope. Well, I am giving you the example of indigenous people, but we could talk about peasants, people who are Afro-descendant. We can also talk about ecologists.
Y María Paula Meneses han definido como
What Maria
epistemología.
Paula Meneses and Aventura have defined as epidemiology of the South, and also recognizing that in the world there are 115 million indigenous people that are self-recognized as indigenous people in 60 countries and 7 regions. 150 million indigenous in Latin America. We have 826 indigenous people. Out of 115 of them live in Colombia. In Colombia, 65 native languages. So we can say that this form of weaving a biocultural and intercultural processes have also been verified and confirmed with studies that indicate that the territories where indigenous people live, they are able to preserve and conserve 80% of the planet biodiversity. And this does not only puts us in the center of the confrontation of the extractivist development model, but it puts us in the target of this geography of hope to defend it against media politics and academic negative narrative that continues to excluding, discriminating again, and stigmatizing them. On the screen, you can see several images from different contexts of this transformational power, but in one way or another, and with this last strong idea, I would like to mention the following. Unfortunately, we are in a global context where they are sort of promoting a narrative of hatred, racism, and violence against these weavers of processes, and they are part of our everyday life. They are even imperceptible. On the slide, you
expresión
can
racista, por
see a
ejemplo,
racist
en una
expression
publicidad
in
que
an
era publicada
advertisement. This advertisement
es española, pero aparece
is
en
from
diferentes
Spain,
medios
but you can
europeos,
see it
de
in
la
different
criminalización de
European
la protesta, de las
media,
diversas
the
sociedades, de todo
criminalization of
tipo,
protest,
ecologistas,
of social
ambientalistas,
movements,
feministas,
ecological,
jóvenes,
feminist,
¿sí? Los
environmentalist,
impactos de la guerra
youngster
en
social
en
movement,
Gaza.
the impacts
Y de
of
esa
the war
manera,
in Gaza.
creo
And
que
in this
no
way,
tengo
I
duda
believe
que
that, and
reconocer
I
los
have no doubts
procesos
about
de
this,
tejedores
that
en
recognizing the
diferentes contextos
processes of
no
weavers in
solamente
different contexts
contribuye a recuperar
does
nuestras
not only
propias
contribute
historias,
to restoring and
a
recovering
reconocer
our
esa
own
capacidad
stories,
transformadora que
also
tenemos los pueblos
recognizing this
étnicos,
transformational
campesinos, mujeres
capacity
y todos
that
los
the
que
ethnical,
he mencionado,
rural,
incluidos los de
indigenous
diversidad
people
sexual, y
have,
sobre
including
todo
the different
a
sexual diversity
cuestionar las
groups, but it also allows
imágenes,
us to
las
question and challenge
narrativas de los
the
medios de
images, the
comunicación y
narratives
gran
of the
parte de
mass
los
media
gobiernos y escenarios
and a
políticos
large
y
part of the
académicos
governments and
en
political
donde
and
nuestra
academic
lucha
scenarios where our
frente a las formas de
fight
desarrollo,
against
de
the forms of
resistencias pacíficas,
development, of
son
peaceful resistance
distorsionadas
are
y son
distorted
negadas
and
con
are
relación a la defensa de la vida, a
denied
la
with
defensa de la
respect to
madre
defense of
naturaleza.
our life, the
Y
defense of our mother
privilegian las
nature, and
economías
they give
extractivistas.
privilege to
Por
the
eso,
extractivist
cuando
economies.
planteo
That is
estos dos
why
interrogantes en paralelo,
when I
¿qué
propose these
cultivamos
two
y qué
parallel
deseamos
questions,
cosechar?
what do we
Lo busco
cultivate
en
and
esta
what do we wish to
intervención, quienes
harvest
han
in this
estado aquí
presentation?
presentes
And
y para no alargar un
those
poquito
of
más la
us,
palabra, es
those of you
que
who
nos
have been
cuestionemos
listening
desde
to
la
me,
cotidianidad todo
we
este
want
racismo
you to
institucional y
ask
estructural
ourselves
que
about this
está incluso
institutional and
dentro de
structural
los
racism,
racismos en expresiones racistas que se camuflan con
this
chistes, con
micro-racism
frases,
that
¿sí?
are
Y de
expressed
esa manera
or
cuestionarnos
camouflaged in
sobre
jokes
el
and
odio, el
other
racismo,
phrases. And
la
we need
afrofobia, la
to ask
xenofobia, la
ourselves and
homofobia, la
question
transfobia,
ourselves about this
y
narrative, hatred,
pensar en
racism,
cómo
classism,
rompemos esas
aporophobia, xenophobia,
estructuras que llevan
homophobia,
a
transphobia,
deshumanizar.
and
Les
how
he
can we
puesto en la
break
pantalla
these structures
una
that lead to this
denuncia que se
dehumanization. On the
de lo que
screen, you
está
can
sucediendo
see
en
a
España
complaint
sobre
that was
los
filed on what is
niños
happening
y
in
niñas
Spain regarding
adolescentes de
the
18 años
boys,
que
girls,
llegan a
and
España
adolescents
sin
under
el
18,
cuidado de un
which
adulto
arrive to
y
Spain
son
without the
considerados
assistance or care of an adult, and they are
en
considered
términos
as
lo
a menace,
legislativo y que sin duda
in
detrás
the
de esto hay una
legislative aspect.
connotación
And behind this,
humanista
there is
y
a
que niega a
connotation
estos
that
seres. Por eso creo
dehumanizes
que es
and denies their
dejarles a
existence.
todos y a
That is
todas
why
quienes hemos
I
estado aquí
want to
presentes
tell
y en
you
la escucha es cómo cultivar
I want to
para
tell
la
all of you,
justicia, la
how can
dignidad,
we
formas de
cultivate for
resistencias
justice and
pacíficas y
dignity
multiculturales
forms of
que nos
intercultural peaceful
permitan darle
resistances
lugar a
that will
esos
allow
otros
us to give
discursos que hemos negado
place
históricamente.
to
Mi
all the
pantalla,
others
muchas
that
gracias.
have been denied historically. Thank you very much.
Gracias, querida
Thank
Adriana.
you, dear
Una
Adriana. It
magnífica
has been
presentación,
a magnificent
como dijo desde el
presentation,
principio, enfatizando
a
la
wonderful lecture,
interculturalidad como
emphasizing the
desafío
aspect
para la
of
construcción de
interculturality
nuevas
as a
bases
challenge
y en
to
respuesta a estos
peacemaking,
interrogantes
and
que
trying to respond to
cultivamos y
two
que
questions.
deseamos
What is it that we
cosechar
cultivate
y
and what
sobre
is
un
it that we wish
énfasis
to
en la paz
harvest?
como un
You
proceso
extensively
de
highlighted peace
comprensión
as
de
a process of
desigualdades,
understanding of
tensiones,
needs,
brechas,
conditions, of
retos de
understanding the needs, the
desigualdad,
conditions,
de la
gaps,
violencia de todo
inequality,
tipo
challenges
que
of all forms of
desafortunadamente
violence
vivimos en nuestra
that
sociedad,
unfortunately we evidence in
desigualdades,
our
derechos,
society, which have
prioridades.
to do with a
También
structure, with a
enfatizó
culture.
en
You
la
also
construcción de la paz como un
emphasized and
proceso de
talked
la vida
about
cotidiana.
peacemaking as a
Esto nos
process of
implica ser
everyday life.
capaces de
And this
transformar
means that we
relaciones
should be capable
sociohistóricas,
of
relaciones
transforming
de
the
historia,
social
social,
historical
política, es decir,
relationships.
construir
That
diversas
is to
alternativas
build and to work on
para ser
different
capaces
alternatives
de
so we can be
concebir la
capable
paz
of
también
conceiving
como un
peace
derecho,
as a
generación
right
de acuerdos
that
y bueno,
goes
nos enfatizó
beyond or
ser
transcends
capaces
agreement,
de
so we
pensar
can be
y de tener
capable
en cuenta
of thinking
las
about,
causas
of
que
taking into
existen
account
detrás de los
this.
procesos
You have talked
de
about the
paz
existence
que
of
promueven
weavers of
entre la
processes and
vida
peacemaking
ancestral,
that
que es
promote
fundamental
ancestral
tener en
encounter,
cuenta
an
para
identity that
construir una
must be taken into
geografía de
account
la
to
paz.
build a
Reiteramos
geography
el
of peace. We
agradecimiento
want
por las
to once again
magníficas ideas
thank you for
compartidas.
your wonderful
A
ideas that you
continuación,
have shared.
podemos
Next,
mantenerse en sala.
we ask you to stay
Vamos a
in the
presentar
room.
dos videos
We
muy
are going to
cortos
present two
para
very
luego
short
pasar al diálogo y
videos,
respuesta,
and then
preguntas y
we will
comentarios
move
muy
on to the
interesantes que nos han
dialogue,
llegado.
to your questions and your
Habíamos
comments.
retomado las dos
So
conferencias anteriores
After listening to these two presentations, since we have been talking about people and organizations capable of weaving peace processes, ORAS, the Andean Health Organization, has a cooperation agreement with different organizations. One of them is Rotary International. We will present two short videos as an example of multiple and diverse initiatives for peace that we have in the Latin American region, in the Andean region, to continue building a geography of hope. Let us remember that Adriana talked about building this geography of hope without forgetting that it is essential to recognize the transformative capacity of all of us, of each and every one of us, of ethnic peoples, of the rural communities, of women, girls, boys, adolescents, young people, people with sexual diversity as well. Well, Rob, can I ask you to please share the video? Peace is, let us be honest, the world might seem terrifying. Violence, poverty, disease, corruption, contamination, pollution problems seem to be quite overwhelming, way too serious. You are just a person, right? If you are a Rotary, you are part of a club, part of a district, part of an international network of 1.2 million Rotaries in 35,000 clubs in 200 nations. This turns you into the largest service organization with the highest impact in the world. Rotaries have almost the same human power as the most powerful armies in the world, with the advantage of being part of the social fabric of the community. With a global organization, Rotary connects you with a network of community leaders who are enthusiastic, focused on generating positive change through surveys and examination of the four stages, the 6 areas of interest of Rotary turns this network into a powerful force of peace. Why should not we start seeing Rotary as something that goes beyond a group of service clubs, and we see each other as a global force for peacemaking? What if all together we make peace? Imagine this, Rotary is building a world beyond war. But before that, let me give you some context. Did you know that we are living in the most peaceful history, the most peaceful period of history in the community? Wars are less common and they affect less lives. The levels of violence against children and women are the lowest in history. Homicides have been drastically reduced in most parts of the world. Genocide and other forms of assassination against civilians are less prevalent. The number of democracies in the world increases every year. People are living longer and healthier life. Girls are receiving better education, and the human rights are recognized in almost all the countries as a basic pillar of democracy. The world is not falling apart, as indicated by the media. As a matter of fact, there are measurable trends that endorse the creation of a global peace system that is now competing with the global war system trends that led to the development of international institutions that seek to prevent war, such as the United Nations, trends on the protection of civilians, trends that demonstrate that non-violence is more effective than armed resistance, trends towards the proliferation of education for peace, trends that favor the peace economy above the war economy, attempts that lead to the flourishing of rights, treaties, and international courts. So why can't we change our mindset as Rotaries so we can coincide with the actual realities, the actual science? The good news is that Rotary has already prepared us for success with the 6 areas of interest: community, economy, and community development. When you build economic opportunities for communities, Rotary builds peace, basic education and literacy. When you provide education where there is no education, Rotary builds peace. health and sanitary services. When you provide clean water and sanitary conditions, Rotary is building and making peace. Maternal and child medical health care, when you improve the health of children and others, Rotary builds peace. Prevention and treatment of diseases, when you prevent and treat diseases, Rotary builds peace. And when you focus specifically on peace and the prevention and resolution of conflicts as a pillar of the activities of your Rotary Club, Rotary builds peace directly. So we are this close of putting an end to polio, but what comes next? For over 100 years, Rotaries have been promoting the understanding, the goodwill and peace through their service work. Now, with the peace as an area of interest, as a network of over 1,000 Rotary scholars, we are ready to take the next step. Peacemaking is about community peacemaking. We are now ready to train leaders, including young people, to build peace and to prevent and mediate conflicts, to bring together human and material resources to increase the impact of peacemaking through Rotary service projects across all the areas of interest, empowering Rotaries all over the world to build sustainable peace in communities and regions affected by conflicts and beyond. You are a Rotary and you build peace. This is your call to action. Start with a peace committee in your club. You can apply with a peace chair in your district. This is a position supported by Rotary. Support the pro-peace Rotary centers by proposing qualified and skilled candidates. You can motivate your club so they can get engaged in at least one service project a year that promotes nonviolence or that generates understanding on the causes of violence. You can do this by joining a Rotary Action Club through the Rotary Action Club. Through this hub map, you can connect with other Rotaries and peace committees. You can have access to the experience of our pro-peace members through the new Peace Hub map. So the world is not as terrifying after all, because peace is you and you are a Rotary. Let us make peace together. Well, we have just shared this video that was sent to us by people from Rotary as a way of exemplifying the different initiatives all over the world to build peace. We wish to thank all of you who have connected from the Ministries of Health, the academia, various entities and social organizations from Argentina, Belize, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador, Spain, Guatemala, Mexico, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Peru, Venezuela, among others. We have received many greetings and congratulations for this webinar, for the topic that has been addressed, for the reflections that have been shared with all of you. And now we are going to begin a dialogue based on some of the questions and comments that we have received. I am going to read one of the questions. Peace based on what? Example, Iceland is the most peaceful country that supports the assassination of whales. Are we talking about a human peace or a peace in the world, which also incorporates the dimension? This is with respect to the actions that we take at the Andean Health Organization, the OAS, in trying to respond to problems related to climate change, for instance, or the climate crisis under the framework of the civil crisis, which questions this model of extractivist development. As you know, significant progress has been made in acknowledging the rights of nature. So please, if you can make a reflection, as mentioned by Adriana, in Colombia, we are about to start Convention number 16 on health and biodiversity on the 21st of October. And we know that biodiversity is critical to the well-being and health. And additionally, if we consider the climate crisis and loss of biodiversity, we're talking about a planet crisis, along with the social inequalities and the vast amount of waste that human beings produce. So, in response to the question that we received from one of the participants, we want to hear your reflections. Thank you. If you wish, I can start first. I can go first. Oh, wow. Such a difficult question, my God. Well, in terms of what we're trying to measure through the index, it is true that what we are using as metrics are essentially these metrics as humans in this particular case. So it's quite limited, but as crimes against biodiversity are better coded, so we can now compare these different metrics all over the world, then we'll be able to learn in more detail about the influence of these aspects in particular. The case of Iceland, and it is true that Iceland, at least according to the index, has been maintained as the most peaceful country in the world from the very beginning of the creation of the index 15 years ago. And I am not familiar with this particular topic, but perhaps Adriana can elaborate on this. This raises the question on indigenous rights. Indigenous rights. And it raises a broader question, which is the very difficult task that we have ahead of us to integrate these radically different perspectives and the incorporation of all these perspectives, for instance, the case of indigenous rights and the utilization of the different resources when the utilization of a resource is done excessively and when it is done sustainably. And the case of the assassination of a whale, as you pointed out, if it is something that we should consider as bad, or whether it should be considered as something good, and which are the limitations or the limits. So I believe that the most important discussions are around these topics, these measures. So I am not giving you the exact answer because it's a very challenging question, but I would like to give the floor to my colleague Adriana. Let me start with 3 comments because the question is quite dense and challenging. Whenever we think about peace or peacemaking with Mother Nature, it is how do we relate to it? Under the framework of COP16, it was interesting to see how the Ministry of the Environment and the national government of Colombia back then actually questioned and challenged the extractivist development model and the fuels or the hydrocarbons in fossil economies. The fossil fuels in the different economies, this is an extremely important element that we can bring to the table as something innovative in terms of peace with nature, questioning the inequality relationships and extractive activities, both at the level of legal and illegal economies. I believe that this is a critical element. The other element that is of the essence is to realize the complexity that exists between the effects of climate change, pollution, and the loss of biodiversity.
En mi intervención evidenciar es cómo se criminalizan
by trying to evidence how is it that they criminalize other forms of conceiving development. They do not only criminalize and stigmatize it, but they are promoting hatred against those who propose it. In this regard, I am referring on the one hand side to
racializados,
the racialized or
indígenas,
ethnical,
afrodescendientes,
indigenous,
afrodescendentes,
Afro-descendant,
ancestrales, a los
Afro-diasporic
campesinos, a las personas ecologistas, a
the
las
people
fuerzas
from rural
feminizadas de diversidad
communities,
sexual. Creo que ese es un
the
elemento
groups
que he
of
tratado de
sexual
introducir
diversity. This is an
y
element
que
I have insisted
precisamente
on.
cuando se
And
hacía la entrada a
when
este webinar, se hablaba que
when
surgieron
we were
estos webinars
talking,
en medio de la pandemia.
I
Yo
mean, when
creo
we
que
were
en
talking
medio
about
de
these
la
webinars
pandemia
before
hemos
formally
visto
starting
una
these webinars,
necesidad de
these
darle
webinars
prioridad a los
began
sistemas de
at the start of the
conocimiento de los
pandemic, and
pueblos
it became visible that
y
we
del
had
reino
to
y pues
give
de los
a
pueblos
place
indígenas
and an importance
alrededor de
to
formas de
the know-how
sanación que
of
no
indigenous
solamente tiene que ver
people,
con
forms
formas
of healing, which
prácticas de
does
sanación
not only have to
ancestral,
do
sino
with
que están situadas
practical
en una de las metas que
ways or
reconocemos que es de
forms
las
of
más álgidas que
providing
se desarrolló en el
ancestral
año
medicine,
2006, que es la
but
meta
it
13, que
also
tiene
has
que
to
ver con
do
el uso
with
de
goal number
recursos
13, which has to do
genéticos
with
y
the
la
use of genetic
salvaguarda del
resources
medio
and
cultural en el planeta,
safeguarding the
que tiene que ver
biocultural
con
life
esa
in the
riqueza y esa
planet, which
forma de
has to do with
conservar
this wealth
la
and
diversidad
this
y que
way
se está
of
cumpliendo.
conserving
En ese momento
biodiversity.
también vivimos,
Well,
y con esto
back
cierro a
then, and with
propósito
this,
de la
I
paz con la
will
naturaleza, como
close
decía
my
Rosa
comment
Sosa,
in terms of
una
peace with
huella
nature, as
ecológica de nuestra
mentioned by
tradición
Marta.
ancestral. Incluso,
There's a
mira,
strong
estamos siendo
ecological
responsables
footprint
nosotros
of
como pueblos,
the everyday
pero
life. I am
también me
responsible for my
gustaría
own
ser
ecological
responsable de los
footprint,
demás, el uso del
but
plástico,
also
el
the
uso de
use of
tanto
plastic, the use
contaminante,
of so
tanto
many
consumo,
pollutants,
pero
so much
además de
consumption, but
desconocer
also
esas
there
formas
is a lack of
alternativas de
knowledge of
economías
these
disponibles
alternative
y cómo no
forms of
volvemos, por
economies,
eso decía
and
yo allí, formas de mediación.
how can we
Los
turn
países
them into
periféricos
mediation forms in those
cotidianamente sufrimos
territories with
tantos
a higher
incendios
level of conflict? We
producidos
were
en la
seeing
Amazonía,
so
tantas
many
lógicas,
forest
tantos daños,
fires
pero
taking place in
también
the
una
Amazon, so
sociedad
much
en
damage, but we
diferentes
also
países
see
impávida,
a
indolencia ante
society
ese dolor de la madre
that
naturaleza. Y con esto cierro.
cannot
La
stand the pain
humanidad
suffered by Mother
puede
Nature.
terminar y la
So
madre naturaleza se
humankind can
sabe
come to an
restablecer.
end, but
Entonces
Mother
es un
Earth
momento
knows
no
how to restore
coyuntural,
itself.
sino
So
urgente
this
de
is a moment of
interpelarnos, de
urgency,
cuestionarnos
of
en cómo
questioning
nos
ourselves
relacionamos.
on
Por eso
how
yo
is it that
decía,
we relate
tiene
to
que ver
Mother
con
Earth. That
las
is why
narrativas
I was
cotidianas, pero
telling you
también
that this
cómo
has to do
observamos
with
cómo está
everyday
sucediendo el
life
planeta
narratives,
y
but we
cómo nos
also need to pay
relacionamos,
attention
porque
to
el
what is happening
problema de
to our
la
planet,
biodiversidad no es
because the
solo en los
problem of
países que
biodiversity
tenemos mayor
is
biodiversidad,
not
sino
only
en
under
todos
the
los países.
responsibility of the
Muchas
countries that have
gracias.
a higher degree of biodiversity, but it is
Muchas
everybody's
gracias por su
responsibility.
respuesta,
Thank you.
muy,
Thank you very
muy
much for your answer.
interesante.
Very nice
Para
and
la
very
persona que
interesting.
hice la
To
pregunta,
the person
recordar
who
la
asked this question,
publicación tan
please
bonita con el
remember
título
the
Pases con la
publication called
naturaleza.
Making Peace with
Definitivamente
Nature,
también
Pases con la
necesitamos apoyar esta
Naturaleza. We also
dimensión,
need to address that particular
reconociendo
dimension,
además que los
also
conflictos
recognizing that
ambientales
environmental
son
conflicts
crecientes
are growing.
en Colombia,
In
por ejemplo.
Colombia, for
Líderes
instance,
ambientales
environmental
son
leaders
asesinados y,
are
como en otros países andinos y
killed,
suramericanos y en
as
el
in other
mundo,
Andean and Latin American
la
countries and
dimensión
other countries in the
ambiental
world.
es
The environmental
prioritaria en este
dimension is
sentido.
relevant in this
También
regard.
nos llegó la
We
pregunta
also received
esta
another
para
question
Michael.
for Michael.
¿Podría indicar cuáles
Can you
son los
please indicate
24
which are the
indicadores de paz
24
positiva? O
indicators
tal
of
vez
positive peace?
los 24,
The
no sé
24,
si los tenga allí a mano.
I don't know
Le
whether you
envié
have
la
them with you.
publicación.
They
Ellos
also asked for the
compartieron
name of the
excelente,
publication. We just shared
excelente
the
trabajo
link
a todas
of the
las
publication
personas que
of the
están
Global Peace
conectadas
Index
en el
with all
Facebook
those
y en
people
el
joining us from
YouTube.
Facebook and YouTube.
Muy bien, sí, por supuesto.
Very well.
Hay el índice global de paz, que sería esta
The
medida de
Global
paz
Peace
negativa,
Index,
y luego hay pues como
which
el
has a site on
informe
negative peace, and
Institute,
then they have the
que
twin
sería
report,
el informe de
which
paz
would be
positiva,
the
con estas
positive peace
24
report with its
métricas
24
que
metrics
menciona
that
José.
you have
Por mi parte,
mentioned.
haría
On
un
my
resumen
side, I
de
will
caso de las
try,
24
I
métricas
wouldn't follow those
que,
24
que a los 8
metrics as
pilares de
much,
paz positiva. ¿Por qué? Pues
rather than
mencioné
the
que había
8
más de
positive
500 métricas
pillars. I
y
mentioned that
diferentes
there
índices
were
que
over
correlaban
500
con estas
metrics and
mejoras en
different
niveles
indices
de paz.
that correlated
Em,
these improvements
Nosotros
in the levels
utilizamos
of peace.
24.
We use
Estas,
24.
estas 500
I mean,
formaban
these
parte de estos
500
8
were part
pilares.
of
No
these
todas
8
caían
pillars.
dentro de
All
estos
of them
pilares.
would fall into
Realizamos algo que se
one of
llama
these
análisis
pillars.
de
We did
factores,
something called
buscando cuáles
factor
son esas cosas que
analysis
tienen en
by
común todos
looking
estos
for
500
those
indicadores y los
things
cuales salen
that
esos
these
8
500
pilares.
indicators have in
Y luego,
common,
por
and that is
cuestiones
how we obtain these 8
computacionales,
pillars. And
tuvimos que
because of
limitarnos
computational issues, we
a,
had
en
to
este
limit
caso, pues
ourselves
a unas
to a number of indicators less than 500, so we could measure trends from one year to the other. So from these 8 pillars, we took 3 indicators, those that are more statistically correlated with improvements in the levels of peace from each pillar. For instance, at the level of acceptance of human rights, the 3 indicators are gender equity, where we see a very strong correlation with improvements in the levels of peace, group taxes, and exclusion due to a socioeconomic group. This would be 3 of the indicators. In the case of equitable distribution of resources, we are looking at the life expectancy in terms of economic differences, access to public services, and equal opportunities. Behind each report, there is a whole methodology of the 24 indicators that we use to measure positive peace every year. So behind the report, you will find all this information, including these 24 indicators. On the back part of the report, he was saying, going back to the pillars, evidently we're talking about global studies here. It is good for it to cover several countries, but it is also critical to contextualize positive peace depending on the case, recognizing evidently the significant difference of cultures that exist all over the world. So that is why I would like to go back to the pillars and not so much on the indicators. So in the case of the equitable distribution of resources, what does it mean to us here in our own specific context?
Muchas gracias. Excelente la respuesta.
Thank you.
Hemos
Excellent
compartido,
answer. We have
el
shared
enlace
the
del
link
informe y también
of
recordarles
the
a
report,
todos
and I would
los
also like to
participantes,
remind
a
all the
todas las
participants
participantes que el evento queda
that
grabado
the
y
event
también
is
la
going to be
presentación. Lleven
recorded.
un
You
enlace
can see the
y donde
presentation
mismo hayan
afterwards, and
ingresado
there's a
este
link
webinar,
in
pues
the
van a
Andean
tener
Health
las presentaciones
Organization
también donde
of
están
the
esos
webinars and
titulares
different
y una
presentations, where you will
síntesis
find
también
the
muy
8
bonita de
pillars,
ese
a very
documento.
nice
Muchas gracias.
summary and
Voy
slide
a
of the 8
distribuir las
pillars.
preguntas
I am
para
going
tener
to
un poquito
distribute the
más de
questions so
tiempo
we can have
y
a
esto
little
de
bit
la
more time. And
siguiente,
I
que es más
think
un
that the next
comentario,
question,
lo
which
puede
is more
responder
than a
Adriana.
comment, can be
Nos
responded by
dice, en
Adriana. It
América
says,
Latina
in
y el
Latin
Caribe,
America and the
los
Caribbean,
niveles de homicidios persistentemente altos se
persistently high
atribuyen a un
homicide
margen de
levels are
acciones
typically
violentas
attributed to violent
relacionadas
actions
con conflictos
related to
entre
conflicts
grupos
between
delictivos
organized
organizados que
criminal
compiten por el
groups
control de mercados
competing
ilegales
for the
y
control of
también
illegal
se
markets.
atribuyen a
They
la
are also
debilidad del
attributed
Estado de
to
Derecho.
problems such as a
Conociendo
weak
su
rule of
formación
law.
como socióloga y
Considering your
también de
training as
políticas
a
públicas,
sociologist and
por
your
favor,
experience
si
on public
pueden generar una
policies,
reflexión
can you
sobre
please
todo esa
give us a
influencia
reflection on
alrededor
the
de avanzar
challenges
en la
around
construcción de
advancing
estados
in
sociales de derecho,
the
reconociendo
construction
que es
of social
fundamental
rules
esto para
of law,
avanzar en la
considering that this
construcción de
is
las
critical
paces?
to advance in peacemaking?
Bueno, yo creo que un elemento
I
fundamental,
believe
y
that a
muchas
key
gracias
element,
Berta
and thank you
por
very
ese
much,
comentario, es
Berta,
que sin duda América
uh,
Latina y el
there's no
Caribe
doubt that
es
Latin
uno de los
America and the
escenarios en los más
Caribbean is one of
profesionales,
the
líderes ambientalistas.
is one of
Para
the
Colombia nada más,
countries where we have the highest level
lamentablemente
of
presume
homicides
el quedar en
of
segundo lugar. A veces
environmental
valía esperar.
leaders,
En el 2020
especially
sacamos un
Colombia in
reporte de 300,
2022. There was a report of
ambientalistas
322 environmental
asesinados,
leaders assassinated.
reconociendo además
We
que
also need to
es muy duro
acknowledge that
contar
it is very
homicidios y más
hard
cuando uno ha tenido la
to
posibilidad de
count the
conocer
homicides,
a personas
especially if
que
you
han
had the
defendido la vida en el
opportunity
territorio.
to
Entonces, por
meet
ejemplo, en
these people who
Colombia,
defended
en los últimos,
life in
nada
the
más este
territory
año,
in Colombia
hace
this
3 semanas,
year.
Carlos
3 weeks
Andrés
ago,
fue
Carlos
un
Andrés
joven guardia
Curue,
indígena
an
asesinado
indigenous
y no entra
youngster
entre
who
estadísticas
was killed.
precisamente
He is
recientes.
not part of
Entonces,
these
cuando es la
statistics, but this
pregunta,
is
la
an example.
responsabilidad no
So
solamente es
the responsibility does not
de la
only lie
estructura
on
estatal o
the
más
state
bien, sino que
structure,
es
or
que
rather, if
la
within the
sociedad
state
hace
structure,
parte
society
como un
is
ejercicio. Yo creo
part
que allí es
of it
donde
as an
los
exercise.
movimientos
This is where
sociales,
the social movements,
las ONGs,
the
las
NGOs,
organizaciones de
the
cooperación internacional, las
international
instancias
cooperation
que hemos estado
agencies
históricamente
that
preocupados por
have been
construir la
historically
paz, tenemos que
concerned
hacer
for
una
peacemaking, we
alerta.
need
Y
to
en decir que
raise
en América
a
Latina
warning,
hay
and we need to
en
say
diferente
that
proporción de lo que se está
In
de
Latin
de la
America,
disidencia que está
in
teniendo el
less
fascismo en
proportion
Europa, en América Latina
as in Europe. In
están
Latin America,
reduciendo
they
las
are
posibilidades
ignoring
de gobiernos
the
progresistas. Entonces,
possibilities
por
to have
ejemplo, en
a
Colombia
progressive
se
government. In
criminaliza la
Colombia,
paz también.
they are criminalizing
Antes
peace.
de empezar, yo comentaba
Before I
que estoy
started
muy
with my
preocupada
presentation, I
cuando, por
was telling you
ejemplo,
that
en un
I'm
estado
very
social
concerned
derecho,
when
Colombia,
in a
que tiene una
social rule of
constitución, una
law as
reforma
Colombia, which
constitucional que
has
es de
a constitutional
1991,
reform of
hoy sí que en el
1991,
artículo 22
and
la
that in
paz es
Article
un derecho. Los
22
medios de
indicates that peace
comunicación
is a right.
hegemónicos
The
prefieren ver la
hegemonic
paz como
mass
un foco
media do
político,
not
pero no
consider
como una
peace as an
ideología.
approach or a
Esto
process,
me
but
genera
rather an
muchísimo temor en
ideology.
términos de un
This
estado social de derecho,
makes me quite
porque
fearful
puede
in
pasar
terms
como ha
of a
ocurrido en
social
diferentes
rule of
partes del
law, state
mundo
of law,
con el
because
enfoque de género.
we
Se
can
vuelven
see the
unos
same
unos
situation
términos a nivel
as the
normativa
gender
de
approach.
proximidad,
They turn
de
it into an
construcción de la paz. Por
ideology, so
consiguiente, yo creo
they
que
do
la
not allow us
responsabilidad no
to have the
solamente
possibility of building peace. So
en
the
entes
responsibility does
institucionales
not only
estatales,
lie
sino
on the
también de una
state
sociedad cada vez
institution,
más
but
consciente
it lies
de
on
cómo
a society
participa
which
en
is
estos
much more
espacios de toma
conscious
de
and aware
decisión
of how
para
they
hacer
participate in these
transformaciones
decision-making levels
estructurales.
to make a
Y desde
structural
allí creo que lo
transformations.
normativo
And I
tiene
believe that the
mucho que
regulatory
jugar, ¿no?
aspect
Cómo
plays a key
reconocemos
role.
que también
How
hay
can we
normas
recognize
estatutarias a
that there are
favor de
some
algunas
norms and
cosas,
standards
pero
that instead of
también hay
favoring, they
normas que
go
nos
against it, but
facilitan
these
que
are their
podamos
standards and
apreciar de una
regulations
manera digamos, más conscientes. O cuando yo
that
digo
could
conscientes,
help
es
us be more
hacer
aware.
uso de
When
esas
I talk
normas,
about
del
aware,
tiempo de
is making
sentencias, de las
use
sentencias
those
con alrededor de
regulations, the
discusiones. Y
sentences
por último,
that
creo
are
que
around
cuando preguntan
non-compliances.
conflictos,
So when
darle
you talk
responsabilidad a
about
otros
conflicts,
actores
giving
que no se
responsibilities to other
mencionan
stakeholders that are
en los
not
estados, que
mentioned
son los medios
at
de
the state level,
comunicación,
which
el
are
sector
the mass
empresarial,
media, the
el
business
sector
sector,
religioso,
the
que no se
religious
mencionan
sector.
cuando se
They
habla
are
de
not mentioned
estructuras
whenever they talk about
y de esta lucha
structures
que se tiene,
and this
muy en
constant
territorio
fight, and
colombiano.
they are
Tienen un nivel
also
de
responsible. They have
corresponsabilidad,
a
no
level of
para que nos veamos como enemigos,
co-responsibility. We should not
por el
see each other
contrario,
as
para
enemies.
mirar los
On the
diferentes
contrary,
actores
we need to
implicados en la
look at the
política,
different
reconocer
stakeholders
la paz como un derecho
involved
y la
so we can
oportunidad de
recognize peace
no
as
solamente
a right
reducir
and
los
the
crímenes
opportunity of not only
focalizados a
reducing
ciertas
targeted
poblaciones, el
crimes or crimes
genocidio que se
against
está
certain
cometiendo
populations
desde Chile
and the
con los
genocide
indígenas,
that
Argentina,
we are
lo que
seeing in
están
Chile
viviendo
with the
con
Mapuches
mapuches
in
sandinistas,
Argentina,
desde
what we are
Guatemala,
seeing with the
Nicaragua,
Mapuches, with
desde
the feminists from
incluso
Nicaragua,
en Ecuador,
Guatemala,
incluido
in
tenemos la
Ecuador,
Constitución, o
in
sea que no me
Felud.
refiero solamente a Colombia.
I am not only
Cómo
referring to
nosotros
Colombia, but
entendemos
how
esta
do we
relación
understand
como
this
institucional,
relationship
que es
with the
estatal, pero que también
with the
responde
state
a tramas y
institutions?
actores
But
que hay que
this
mencionar.
also
Podemos
has to do
mencionar
with
monetaria, el Banco
actions
Interamericano de
of other
Desarrollo,
stakeholders,
cuestionarles
such as
también
the
sus
IDB,
políticas económicas y la forma como inciden también
the
en estas
International Monetary Fund, their
polarizaciones que se
policies,
vienen dando
and
en América
their
Latina
impact
y
on
el
these
Caribe.
polarizations we see
Muchas
in
gracias.
Latin America and the
Sí,
Caribbean.
muchas
Thank you.
gracias.
Thank you.
Esta pregunta
Well,
sugiero la pueda contestar
this
Michael,
question
si le
perhaps can be
parece
answered by
bien.
Michael, if you
Eh,
agree.
Dice así, es un comentario también
This is also
escrito
a
una persona
comment
conectada
sent by
en
a
las redes
person
sociales. Dice, en
through
América
the
Latina
social
y el
media. It says, in
Caribe
Latin America and the
existe
Caribbean,
una
there is
proporción
still a high
elevada
proportion
de personas
of
que
people
al ser
who,
víctimas
when
de
they
algún
are
tipo de
victims of
delito o
some type
acto de
of crime
violencia,
or act
ya
of
sea robo,
violence,
agresión
whether a
física,
robbery,
agresión
physical aggression, or
sexual,
sexual
no
assault,
realizan la denuncia
they do not
ante las
file the
autoridades
corresponding
u
complaint
otros
with the competent
mecanismos de resolución
authorities
de
or other
conflictos,
officially recognized
detenciones
conflict
oficialmente.
resolution mechanisms.
Por lo tanto, no se
And
cuenta con la
therefore,
posibilidad
they
de
do not have the
resarcirse del
possibility
daño.
of
Es
redressing the
decir, no
harm
acceden a
received.
la
In other words,
justicia.
they do not have access
Me
to
gustaría
justice.
saber de qué
We would
manera
like
el
to know
informe
how
tiene
is
en
it that
cuenta,
the
digamos,
report takes
esta gran
into
cantidad de
account this
subregistros de
high number
hechos, de
of under
problemas que de alguna u otra
registration of
manera inciden en
complaints
la
or problems
construcción
that
de
have
paz.
an impact on the peacemaking
Sí, es
process?
muy buena pregunta,
Yes,
Berta. Y
that's a
una de
very
las
good
razones
question,
por las que
Bert, and
estamos
one of the
persiguiendo ahora
reasons why
oportunidades para
we
alcanzar el
are
índice de paz latinoamericano
pursuing
específico. No
opportunities
sé si hay
to
alguna
develop a specific
organización
Latin American
interesada en
Peace Index.
colaborar.
So if there's any
Nosotros sería
organization
muchísimo, porque cuando uno
interested in
realiza un
collaborating
índice
with
como este
us, we
nivel
would like to
global,
hear with them because
la
when
verdad
you
es que eso
develop
adquiere
a
de
global
un
index, you
cierto
sort
elemento
of
de granularidad.
lose a certain element of granularity of detail because of the context, the culture, but also because if you make an effort based on a specific country, specific region, you can use databases that would not exist globally. So the challenge of the index is to find metrics which are globally comparable. You can have a country where there are 10 metrics of biodiversity, another country where they only have 2 of those metrics. If you wish to compare these 2 countries, you can only use those 2 metrics because only those 2 are comparable. So you lose a high level of granularity and it doesn't allow you to measure these different elements. Let me share the example of gender diversity. This is something that all over the world is not reported at many instances. In some countries, it has made significant improvements, and we live in an environment where these things can be reported. They are even reporting historical cases. But in other countries, as in the case of homicides, there are many people who do not report, who do not file complaints. There are no processes. And whenever you report this to the police, they do not do anything about it, or they do not take note of it, and therefore they do not consider it as part of the system as it should. Once again, it is a limitation in terms of global index, but it is at the same time an opportunity to study and consider a more regional index. A way in which we try to address this partly is through a question, an indicator of the index. The question is, do you feel safe walking alone during the night in the city, in your city? So even though this is an approximate metric and tangential metric, it could cover in part this dynamics. But as I said, right now it's quite
Qué
limited.
interesante lo que nos
Yes,
dices
how
sobre la
interesting
importancia de
what
la
you have mentioned
biodiversidad
about
en
the
América Latina.
interesting of developing an index for
Enfocadas
Latin
en
America. For
otras
instance,
preguntas, otros
here we have received
comentarios,
other questions, other
de
comments
reflexión sobre la
on reflection
desconfianza
about
en las
distrust
instituciones, sobre
in the
qué significa
institutions.
esto
What
en
does this
relación con los
mean
conflictos
in terms
sociales?
of
También nos
social
preguntan
conflicts? They
sobre
also
el papel
ask
del
us
medio
about
ambiente y
the
los
role of the
ecosistemas en nuestra
environment and
región,
ecosystems in
en
our
América
region,
Latina, en la
in
región
Latin
andina, que presenta
America, the
biodiversidad muy
Andean region,
pocas.
especially the loss of
También
biodiversity for
preguntan
the culture of
sobre
peace. They
medidas
also ask about
prioritarias
priority
para
measures
contribuir
to
a la
contribute to
resolución,
the
sobre todo de la
resolution,
delincuencia organizada,
especially organized
que sabemos que
crime,
está aumentando. Agradecemos las
and
preguntas
they
realizadas,
have perceived that this is
agradecemos todos
increasing.
los
Thank you very
comentarios
much for
también.
all the comments that
Muchos
we
de
have
ellos saben,
received.
quienes nos siguen y participan con
Those of you
frecuencia
who
en los
follow us
webinars de la
and
región andino de salud,
participate
que
in
los
the
tendremos
webinars
en
of the Andean
cuenta
Health
para definir
Organization,
temas
you know that we
próximos
will
en
take
los que
them
debemos
into
volver.
account so
Valoramos
we
mucho la
can agree on
participación
the
y el
next
interés,
topics for
y
our
para cerrar este
webinars.
ciclo
So we
de
value your
preguntas y
participation and interest.
respuestas,
And to close this
les
space of
pido por
questions and
favor
answers,
que
I ask
Michael y
you,
querida Adriana nos dejen un último
please,
comentario.
Michael and Adriana, just leave us with your one final message. Thank you. Adriana, please.
Pues habría muchos
Well,
mensajes frente a cómo
I believe
cultivar
that there are many
una
messages
cultura de
on how
paz,
to
tanto en
cultivate a
cómo
culture of peace,
nos hacemos responsables
and
de
also
lo que
how
hacemos
can we
desde cada lugar de enunciación
we
frente a
we
lo
have
que
to be
queremos
responsible
cultivar y
for
lo que
it,
queremos cosechar.
responsible
Pero
for
sobre
what we want
todo,
to
y
cultivate
aquí
and we want to
honro la
harvest.
memoria
Here we like to
de una
honor the
hermana
memory of a
hermosa,
sister, a
que
beautiful
nos ayudó
sister of
y
mine who
Kate,
helped
que
us
nos ayudó a pensar
in
que
Kate, who helped us
cuando
think
las mujeres,
that when
las
women,
mujeres
she was referring
específicamente,
to women, I am
cuando
going
las
to speak in
personas nos
general,
quitamos el
when
manto del
people
miedo y nos
sort of
ponemos la
remove
máscara de la
this cloth
esperanza,
of fear and we
todos
put
los
on the
cambios se
cloth of
pueden pasar.
hope, all
Entonces
changes
esto
are
es
possible.
supremamente
So
reparador.
this
Y
is
Panchani,
extremely
muchas
repairing.
gracias por este
Yupanchani,
espacio
thank you very much
y
for
a
giving me this
los maestros que he
opportunity.
tenido
And
aquí,
also thank you
Michael
very
y
much
Berta,
to
para
Michael and
iniciar esta
Berta
conversación.
for joining me in this discussion. Thank you, thank you. On my side, well, I just want to tell you that in terms, as a way of reflection, I have read some comments about the application of the culture of peace. So Hopefully, as a group, we have been able to contribute to this discussion by sharing different tools. Just trying to echo Adriana's words that even though this is a challenge and it is a systemic challenge, we need to consider a number of things. There are very tangible and practical actions that we can take on at an individual level to build peace in the long run. Among all of us, we have been able to mention some of these examples. Thank you. Very nice answers. We can do this in the day-to-day life with the
Muchas gracias. Reiteramos el
mantle and
agradecimiento por
the
la
cloak
excelente
of
ponencias
hope.
el día de hoy,
Thank you very
querida
much
doctora
for your
Adriana.
presentation, dear
Recibimos
Michael,
muchas
dear Adriana.
felicitaciones
We have
en
received
nuestras redes
many
sociales.
congratulations
Gracias a
in our
todos
social
los
media. Thank you
participantes,
to
al
all the
equipo del Organigrama
participants,
1 de
to the
Salud
Horas
y a
Kanu
todas las
team,
personas
and
que
to all the
participan
people
en esta
involved
actividad
in
que
this
ha sido
activity,
posible
which has been
gracias al
possible
compromiso
thanks
con
to
la
the
cooperación
commitment
andina y
to Andean and
latinoamericana.
Latin American
Cedo la palabra a
integration. I
la
would like to
doctora
give the floor to Dr. Maria del
secretaria
Carmen,
adjunta
Marisela
al
Malki,
cierre
sorry,
de este webinar. En
Deputy
nombre del
Secretary,
Organigrama
to
1 de
close this
Salud,
webinar on behalf of the Andean Health Organization, Hipólito Unanue Agreement. Dr. Garcia, over to you. Thank you, Bertita. Thank you very much. Let me start by expressing my gratitude to the brilliant presentations of our speakers, Dr. Michael and Dr. Adriana, because they have addressed a very important topic that the Andean Health Organization didn't want to ignore now that we are celebrating the International Day of Peace on the 21st of September with their motto of cultivating a culture of peace. And we wanted to include it in our agenda of these webinars. As you know, we have been organizing these webinars every week since 2020, especially now that this year it will mark the 25 year of adopting the Declaration and Program of Action on a Culture of Peace by the United Nations Assembly. And they have mentioned that in such a declaration, they recognize peace not only as an absence of conflict, but that it requires guaranteeing human rights and positive processes as described by both speakers in their presentations. The Global Peace Index is of the essence because we always have to measure what we do to do things better. But as pointed out by Dr. Michael Collins, perhaps we need to focus on the most important aspect, the pillars, the good functioning of the government, the equitable distribution of resources, which is something so difficult, so complex. And we know that Latin America is the most unequal region. And this is something we need to work on, all of us, each of the countries, each of the citizens and the corresponding authorities. The free flow of information that every studying citizen expects from their countries, the good relationships with their neighbors, something which is so essential. They seem basic, but they are so important to achieve positive peace. This high level of human capital, the acceptance of the rights of others, this is something that should be easy to understand, to put into practice, and to respect. But unfortunately, we also need to talk about corruption. These levels need to go down, need to come down. Unfortunately, our region, our countries are suffering from this problem that we hope to solve gradually. And promising business environment, as Dr. Adriana said, peace as a right. She has said that this is a process that focuses on coexistence to address these inequalities under the framework of interculturality for peacemaking. What is it that we sow? What is it that we harvest? That is very important. We are very grateful to our speakers for the Andean Health Organization, or AES. Health has always been a bridge to peace. We need to underscore that peace and citizen coexistence are critical elements in our strategic plans that runs until 2030. And that is reflected on the work with all our partner organizations in the 33 spaces that we manage through our work. I am sorry, we can no longer hear the speaker. Well, let us just wait one more minute to see if the speaker can reconnect to the call.
Lo siento, creo que se fue el internet. Se fue el internet un instante. Bueno, solo reiteraba el agradecimiento y recordaba que esto lo vemos a la salud es un puente para la paz en el organismo andino de salud y que trabajamos eso con nuestros socios estratégicos y en los espacios que tenemos con los representantes de los ministerios de salud. Y reiteraba el agradecimiento también a Bertita por la organización y a todo el equipo de Loras Cono, y a Dira, Rob, Ruby, todos los que han tenido que intervenir para seguir desarrollando estos eventos semana a semana. Y aprovechamos también para invitarlos al próximo evento del jueves siguiente. Esto va a ser un poco más temprano porque va a ser un foro virtual internacional relacionado a la atención en salud mental como una estrategia para la prevención del embarazo en los niños y adolescentes menores de 15 años. Reitero el agradecimiento y nos estamos viendo. Hasta pronto.